Gary Stevenson, the city trader turned wealth tax campaigner, has quit his YouTube channel, Gary's Economics. For those of you who don't know him, Gary is the best city trader in the world. At least that's according to Gary Stevenson. He's also one of the best, if not the best, inequality economists in the world. Again, according to Gary Stevenson. Gary made his name by calling for a wealth tax. Under his proposals, everyone who earns above £10 million would be taxed on 2% of their assets every year. But in a recent Channel 4 documentary, his proposals were torn to shreds by experts.
Absolute populist claptrap, and the people pushing this should be ashamed of themselves.
Even The Guardian called his proposals and his performance embarrassing. Now, even if Stevenson has left the scene, the idea of a wealth tax lives on. Zach Polanski, the Green Party leader, is an enthusiastic backer of a wealth tax, and even Labour Prime Minister Andy Burnham has refused to rule one out. I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spiked, and to discuss this, I'm joined down the line by the IEA's Editorial Director, Kristian Niemietz. Kristian, welcome.
Thanks for the invitation.
Kristian, first of all, I want to discuss the problem that Gary Stevenson says he's seeking to address. He claims that wealth inequality is spiraling out of control, the rich are getting exponentially richer, the poor getting poorer. Unless we introduce a wealth tax, unless we put a stop to that, then people are going to reach Dickensian levels of poverty. But is it actually true that wealth inequality is rising in this way?
No, it's not true at all. And that's part of the issue here. So, I don't have a particular view on what exactly the shape of the wealth distribution should be. I don't have a view on what the ideal wealth distribution would look like. But whatever you think about wealth inequality, you can take the view that it's too high. You can take the view that it should be falling. All of that, that's a matter of opinion. But as the saying goes, people are entitled to their own opinions, but not to their own facts. And it's simply not true that wealth inequality is rising. Stevenson keeps making this claim. He gets invited on every channel. For a while, it seemed like he was on TV 24 hours a day, rent-free in the TV studio, constantly repeating this assertion that wealth inequality is exploding. I've never seen anyone challenging him on those basic facts, asking him, is this actually true? And it isn't true. So we have data on this. This is from the Asset and Wealth Survey, where they've been compiling data on wealth and how it's distributed geographically and across the distribution and across various other variables for decades. And what we can see is simply that the top percentile of the wealth distribution, so the wealthiest 1% in the country, they hold about 22% of the total wealth owned by the entire British population. And that figure has been almost completely flat for, 30 years or so now. And by historic standards, it's actually quite low. So this used to be, if you go back to, say, 1900 or so, early 20th century, there it would be more than 70%. The top percentile of the wealth distribution would really own the bulk of the wealth in the country. And then that share used to fall for most of the 20th century, and then it flattened out in the 1980s. There it was slightly below 20%. In the 90s, it went up a little bit again, from just below 20% to just above. And since then, it's been completely flat. Now, if you want to argue that 22% is too much, that it should be 20%, that it should be 18%, that it should be 15%, fair enough. Make that point. That's all fine. But you can't you can't assert that it's rising when it's not. It's been at 22% for 30 years. It's completely flat. It is not rising. Now, I'm sure you could somehow challenge those figures. I've seen economists claim that some wealth is underreported, and if you try to correct the figures in various ways, you get a slightly higher share. It could maybe be 23%, it could be 24%. All of that is fine as well. But even then, if it's true that some multimillionaires underreport their wealth today, that would already have been true 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So this is true across time. It would still not give you a rising trend. If you want to make those corrections, you also have to make them for data from 10 years, 20 years, 30 years ago. And then if there's no reason to believe that there's more wealth underreporting going on today than in previous decades, or that this is a uniquely British problem, that millionaires in Switzerland or Austria or France all report everything perfectly honestly, and that it's only the British ones who underreport their wealth. So if we're interested in how unequal is Britain compared to other economies, or how unequal is Britain today compared to Britain in the past, then it's clearly the case that Britain is not especially unequal.
And let's say that we want to introduce this tax because we want to fund public services, or close the budget deficit. We already have a lot of taxes on income. Let's tax wealth instead, or in addition to that. What are the problems with introducing a wealth tax? Why do we not have one?
Well, there were plans in the past to introduce one. This isn't a new idea at all. This was, in fact, already debated after the First World War. There were people saying we should introduce a wealth tax. Well, they didn't call it that at the time, but what we would call the wealth tax nowadays, to pay off some of the wartime debt. And it was a big thing in the 1970s again. It almost happened. It came close. It was already in preparation under the Labour government in the 1970s. And then once they looked at the practicalities, they abandoned it. And that is really the main issue with it. It is the practicalities. So I'm a free market here, so I have an ideological preference for a smaller state and lower taxes. But I don't have a particular ideological preference for or against particular types of taxes. So I accept we need some taxes, unfortunately, whether that is primarily taxation of income or consumption or wealth. I don't have an ideological preference either way there. For me, it's really about what is the least distortionary way of raising taxes, what's the type of taxation that does the least damage, and what's the type of taxation that is least bureaucratic, least intrusive. And if you look at wealth taxes in that way, that's when it becomes clear that they are a truly terrible type of taxation. If it was possible to do this in a non-bureaucratic way, then you could say, well, it's not automatically worse than taxing income or taxing consumption, but it isn't. That's the whole problem with wealth taxation, that you have a tax basis that is very difficult and bureaucratic to value. So most of the taxes that we have, income taxes, national insurance, corporation tax, VAT, they are tied in some way to a transaction. So let's say you buy something from me for £100. The taxman just observes that transaction and says, I want 20% of that. And that's relatively easy. But if, say, the taxman said, I want to tax your assets, then you have the issue that, well, if you own assets that have never been sold or that haven't been sold in a long time, nobody knows what they are worth. We only know what something is worth once you offer it on the market and you see what people are prepared to pay for this. And this is an issue for, say, for businesses, for that type of wealth, or for property, for things that are just sold infrequently. So I experienced this last year. I had to move house because my then landlord was selling, and I asked him out of curiosity, how much do you want for that place? How much do you think of selling it for? And he said, well, I have no idea. I need a valuation first because the place hasn't been sold since the 1990s. I have no idea how much it's worth. And this is London Zone 2. If that's an issue in London Zone 2, and I should say this is in a neighborhood where you have lots of near identical properties nearby. If that's an issue in a place like that, imagine what it would be like in places where you have even fewer transactions, where you have more idiosyncrasies, where each property is different from the next one, and that kind of stuff. Or for businesses, say, imagine you are a part owner of a business, and it's never been sold. It was set up as a family business. You have no idea how much it would be worth until you offer it and you see how much people are prepared to pay for it. So, of course, wealth can be valued indirectly. That's the way it's been done in countries that had wealth taxes, and it's also the way it needs to be done if, say, you have a billionaire going through a divorce and they need to split their assets. Then you need some court process to somehow value their assets to determine, right, this person gets that, the other person gets that. It's all possible. It's intensely complex and bureaucratic, and it's in itself not a costless process. So you have the admin expenses, the administrative cost of valuation. that swallows up a big part of the tax revenue. That's one reason why nobody has ever managed to raise much revenue from a wealth tax.
And what are the risks of wealthy people simply leaving the country, not doing business in the country? I mean, we do live in a globalized world where it's quite easy to do that. I suppose then people then get into questions around exit taxes, and again, you feel like people are going to just leave even more quickly. What are the risks on that side, that actually it just decreases the tax base as well as the administrative costs?
Yes, so that we don't know precisely how that would work out in the British case. We have a lot of evidence for how people respond to wealth taxes in the case of Spain and Switzerland. And there people do respond by moving. It's just that in their case, these are regional taxes. So in the Swiss case, it differs from canton to canton. In the Spanish case, it differs from region to region. And there people do move from cantons with higher wealth taxes to cantons with lower ones. There you could, of course, argue, well, okay, but that's relatively easy to do if you move from one canton to another in a small country, and let's say it's two cantons that have the same language and everything. It's not that big of a deal. It doesn't mean that you completely change your life. It would be different from in Britain. If we had a wealth tax here, it would almost certainly be a nationwide tax. So it's not that it would be different, that London would have a different rate compared to Oxford or Cambridge. And then exit would be more difficult because it would mean you would have to leave the whole country. So there we don't know how that will work out. That's a bit trickier to do than moving from one canton to another. But then again, one difference between Britain and other countries that have wealth taxes is also that here, a lot of the people at the top end of, well, whether it's the wealth distribution or the income distribution, an unusually high proportion of those people are foreign born. So you may have a millionaire who made some of their wealth in California or in Singapore, and those people have in the past, they found Britain or London specifically an attractive place to live, and London has been a bit of a magnet for wealthy people. And but for those people, it is quite a common arrangement to have a secondary residence already. So they may divide their time between London and Dubai, Singapore, Hong Kong, wherever. And then, of course, for those people, moving to the other place would not mean what moving to a different country would mean for you or for me. For us, it would mean you pack your bags and you completely you start a new life somewhere else. That's obviously a massively disruptive decision. This could well be the most important decision you ever make in your life. It's not something you would do lightheartedly. You wouldn't do this just to save a few quid. But if you already spend your time, say, between two places, and you just rebalance that slightly. You say, rather than spending 6 months in London, I reduce that to 3 months. That's not such a big change, is it? And I know people who have done that. That is certainly doable. So that will be a reason to believe that the responses to a wealth tax will be stronger here than they are elsewhere. But we don't know the answer. It's just that the trouble with the kind of wealth tax that we're talking about right now, the sort of wealth tax that the Polanskis and the Stevensons of this world are proposing, is an unusual wealth tax in the sense that very few people would pay it. So it would rest on a very narrow base. And that's different from the historic wealth taxes. If you have a wealth tax that is paid by, say, 10% of the population or 20%, then you have a much broader base. And there you could say, well, it doesn't matter so much if some of them leave. If some of them want to leave, well, goodbye. Good riddance. But if you have a wealth tax that's only paid by, say, 50,000 people, that's a very narrow base. Even if just a small number of them leave, that already has massive implications for your tax revenue.
And let's just suppose, we can suspend our disbelief for a moment that Gary Stevenson is right, that the wealth tax will go off without a hitch, and it will raise the £24 billion a year that he claims it will. I mean, would that be anything like enough to, fund the public services that we want, to plug the British budget deficit? It seems like it wouldn't even touch the sides of things.
No, it wouldn't. And that would be, so let's say he's right about that figure, which I don't believe, but it would be very optimistic. It would be at the top end of what any wealth tax that has previously existed has raised, but it would be about 1% of GDP. And we currently have a budget deficit of about 4% or so of GDP, if not more. And even if you spend all that money on public services, well, there is no level of public spending at which you would think you would have the impression that this is enough, or certainly at which they did the big government campaigners, the people who read The Guardian, the big government advocates. There's no level of public spending at which those people would say, that's enough, now I'm happy. It's not as if you look at places where the tax burden is already substantially higher, say France or Belgium, where public spending is more than 50% of GDP, they have pretty much exactly the same debates that we have here. There you also have sections of the population, say trade unions, left-wing parties, left-wing newspapers, and so forth, arguing our pension system is underfunded, our social services are underfunded. We need to spend more on this. We need to spend more on that. We need to spend more on the climate transition, the green economy, all that. These are bottomless pits. You could always spend more on these things. And if we look at public spending in Britain right now, so right now it's about 45% of GDP. Up from just below 40% before the pandemic. Has anyone really noticed a big improvement in public services? Is there anyone in the country, say even Guardian readers, who would say, well, things were terrible before the pandemic in 2019, 2018, we were living in Dickensian squalor, in an absolute neoliberal small state hellhole, but now we're at least halfway towards our utopia. No, you have the same people who were talking about austerity and the state being dismantled in 2018, 2019 still say the same thing today. And those additional 4 percentage points, 5 percentage points of GDP that are spent by the state in the form of public spending on the NHS, on the welfare state, on other on public services, they have more or less just vanished. Nobody really seems to notice much of a difference there. And you can't tell me that adding another percentage point to that would make a big difference. That if we increased public spending from 44% to 45% of GDP, or 45 to 46, that the Guardian would then write articles saying, now we're happy. This is what we've always wanted, and now we will close down our paper and retire.
Yeah, obviously not going to happen. I do want to talk about another zombie idea that won't die, and that's rent control. Zoran Mamdani in New York has boasted about freezing rents. Zach Polanski, again, of course, is calling for rent controls in the UK. Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, is constantly campaigning for rent controls. I mean, the obvious question is, rents are too high. They're going up too quickly. Why not just say to landlords, stop it? What's the problem there?
Well, the problem is that this would be the equivalent of banning red signals on the tube. When I had this again on the way in this morning, I was endlessly delayed because there was a red signal all the time, and sometimes your impulse is you want to shout, ignore the damn thing, just drive. The trouble is the signal signals something. It's a signal of some obstacle that is ahead, and you can switch off the signal, but that doesn't switch off the thing that it is signaling. And it's the same thing with prices. Prices are signals. Prices are scarcity signals. They are messengers. They tell us something about economic conditions. And what high rents tell you is that the area where rents are high is a place where you have lots of people looking for a place to live and not enough people offering those places. You have demand exceeding supply. That is what a high price, whether that's for a rental property or anything else, is signaling to you. Now, there are some exceptions to this. If you have, say, monopoly power and all that, there you can sometimes say, well, it's not really a signal of scarcity there. It's more a signal of, it's more a manifestation of market power and all that. But the property market isn't really like that. There, it's more, well, anyone could, who has the space, who has the property, could, in principle, become a landlord. Anyone could say, I will convert part of my house into a self-contained studio flat or whatever. There, it's not market power in the sense that you have one single entity controlling a massive share of the market. It's more that we have an absolute shortage of buildings. We have the lowest level of housing supply in the developed world, arguably. We have fewer housing units relative to population size, and the ones that we have are also unusually small. So British homes are smaller than Western European ones and much smaller than North American ones. So there just isn't enough living. There aren't enough properties, residential areas to go around. Not enough places to live in to go around. And you have lots of people who want to live somewhere, understandably. And well, we somehow, if we don't like that outcome, we need to make it easier to build. And this isn't a radical new idea. You can find government reports, government white papers, expert reviews going back more than 20 years saying exactly that. This is almost a consensus view where this is almost a ritual now where every government publishes another white paper saying we need to build more houses, and then nothing happens, or rather they try to draft some legislation, and then you get some NIMBY protests, and then the government panics and rolls back and U-turns again, and then nothing ever happens. But essentially, in economic terms, it's a very simple problem that we're describing here. We have demand for housing vastly exceeding supply. We need to increase the supply of it. And as long as that doesn't happen, messing around with the prices will not get you anywhere. It will just make it even worse, because what rent controls do is at least some landlords will exit the market. They will stop being landlords. And that doesn't even mean that they necessarily sell their place so that somebody could then become an owner-occupier. It could just mean, specifically in London, you have lots of, say, basement flats that would be part of the same property where the landlord lives, so amateur landlords. And what people in that situation can do is simply, they could convert that basement into a part of their property. So I used to live in a basement flat for several years where the landlord and his family were living above. And I'm sure they could have used that place. They could have used that basement, the basement flat that I was living in. I'm sure that was at one point just a part of the house that they would have used as either a storage room or a study room or a place for one of his children or whatever. I'm sure they could have found a use. It's just that they knew, with London rents being what they are, leaving that basement and using it for themselves when they didn't absolutely need it would mean foregoing hundreds of pounds a month, and they weren't prepared to just say no to that rental income. And so for them, it made sense to say, well, we won't use that space. We give it to someone else and we just collect the money. But if you had now told them, you can only charge 80% or 70% or whatever of the rent that you were previously charging, well, I suspect they would then have said, well, in that case, we're not doing it. So some of those landlords would exit the market, and the problem would be even worse than the situation you were starting from.
And finally, aside from building more houses, what other things could the government prioritize other than things like rent controls or wealth taxes, if they did want to make life more affordable for people, if they did want to generate some growth and put money in people's pockets? Because if nothing else, that is something that everyone cares about across the political spectrum.
Well, one obvious thing is we could just abandon the whole net zero decarbonization agenda, because that was, I'd say, adopted in a moment of collective hysteria. When you had, if you remember, well, I remember this around here, and I'm recording this from Westminster. We had in 2018-19, we had all these climate protests here all the time. There were days when it was hard to get into the office because you had to go through thousands of climate protesters. And I was wondering, even at the time, what new information has emerged that triggered this movement? It was just climate change wasn't new. We knew in 2018-19 that climate change was happening, that climate was changing, and we had a climate policy. It's not that this idea suddenly popped up out of nowhere. It's just that we had this collective hysteria, that we had the Greta Thunberg protests, and Greta Thunberg herself, of course, visited Parliament, and you had the whole political establishment clapping like seals and dancing around her. And it was this moment of madness when the Theresa May government, in its dying days, when they thought, oh no, we're on the wrong side of history and everyone hates us, and we need to do something that's in line with the current zeitgeist, and that's how net zero became a thing. And I would simply go back to the way things were, say, before the Climate Change Act of 2008. So it's not that you could just pump carbon into the atmosphere at will. We had a cap and trade system where you had to buy permits if you wanted to emit CO2. So it's not that that sector was completely unregulated. You had to pay those permit prices, and that even if there had not been a Climate Change Act in 2008, there would still have been a financial incentive to reduce your carbon emissions if you found that economically feasible, and if that's something where, say, you could switch to a different production technology that is less carbon intensive, there would already be an incentive to do that, and it was already happening, just not at the speed at which it would happen later on. So there was a downward trend already in terms of CO2 output, and that would have continued. There was no need, I would say, to accelerate that beyond what was already happening at the time, especially if we bear in mind, and it's always worth pointing this out, Britain contributes less than 1% to total global carbon emissions. We could switch off the entire British economy today. It would make no detectable difference to global CO2 emissions and global carbon emissions. And I know environmentalists hate it when you make that argument, because this sounds like a passing the buck argument, a free riding argument. They will say, well, but somebody has to make a start. Yes, but we have made a start many years ago. It's just that nobody's following. And the smart thing to do in a situation like that isn't to double down and hope that one day some others will follow. When others are clearly not following, then don't keep shooting yourself in the foot. Don't boycott your own economy if it's not producing any good. This should be an energy-rich country. Britain should really just make use of the energy sources that it has domestically, and should put, say, some moderate cost on carbon emissions, but otherwise be an energy abundant economy, whether that's nuclear, North Sea oil, fracking, all of it. And that would bring down energy prices and stimulate economic activity. It's really quite simple. We're simply boycotting ourselves in that respect. We are rationing input factors into economic life that are abundant, that we don't need to create or invent from scratch. They are already there. And that's why there used to be this campaign from The Guardian called Leave It in the Ground. And it's an interesting name, because in a sense, that's what we've done. But it also shows it's just the stuff is there. We just need to use it.
Well, fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Kristian Niemietz. Thank you for coming on the show.
My pleasure.